The Rebellers by Jane Roberts. Published 1963. Inside cover. Standing room only was the world's slogan. In the 20th century, a typical, quiet, small American city. In the 23rd century, a teeming, wildly overpopulated, quote, "contropolis," end quote, where millions of starved, half-crazed people swarmed through the streets in a purposeless search for food, for rest, or for death. Above the mad, carnival-like scene, the loudspeakers blared out their command to work until night brings quiet and the, quote, "street cleaners," end quote, came to shovel up the bodies of the dying. Into this nightmarish world of the future came Gary Finch, a man who had not seen the outside world for 15 years. He found himself faced with the almost impossible task of bringing order to a completely chaotic world, of restoring some remnant of civilization to a breed that had turned into animals. And in saving mankind, he also had to face a new scourge, the return of plague. Cast of characters: Gary Finch. His knowledge of the past was the key to the future, if there was going to be one. Janice. She didn't look like a girl who could kill. Sloat Braille. He played both ends against the middle and was caught where they met. Gunny Bragan. He wanted to save the world by saving himself. Toby. He was the leader of the rebellers until they rebelled against him. Mayor Lyle. He represented the law, but the law was a joke. Chapter 1. Gary Finch looked down at the city from his cell on the 15th floor of the Affiliated Art Gallery of the Northeast. The building was the highest in the area, and beneath Gary's vision, the Contropolis spread out over the mountains and valleys as far as he could see. Men had erected their shoddy apartment houses and three-deckered tailors everywhere. Vermin-ridden huts cluttered the filthy banks of the Chemung River to the east, and shelters of all kinds rose from the hills instead of trees. Mandy Braille, Finch's cellmate, sat behind him on the old rusted cot. Mandy said anxiously, "Well, do you see the supply trucks?" Finch searched the scene again before answering. The grimy streets below were black with people, thick as insects on the face of the city. A 25-foot wall surrounded the gallery to protect the inmates from the populace. But from the upper stories, you could see over it easily. The supply trucks were not in sight. The courtyard was vacant. Mandy said, "Don't you see the trucks? Maybe they got held up or something, that's all." Well, They can't send food up from the kitchens if the trucks don't bring any, Finch said wearily. I don't think they care about the artists one way or another any more. If you want the truth, our food rations have been less and less. Maybe another plague has been killing the workers off. Maybe the chemical gardens went askew. Maybe the government wants to starve us to death. There's always that possibility. Oh, they'll take care of us all right, Mandy said. We're too important to the economy. What economy? Finch said impatiently. Starvation isn't economy. Mandy shrugged. Griping doesn't help. Nobody's been satisfied for so long that it isn't funny. But what is. You can't argue about that. They were both hungry. It was supper hour, except for the third straight day no supper came up the noisy dumbwaiters. They'd had a skimpy breakfast, but that was all. Gary Finch stood by the window, scowling. They were both thirsty, too. There wasn't enough water to go round. They hadn't really been enough in years. The artists all had beards. More often than not, the beards had lice. Finch said, I don't like the looks of the people either. For days now, they've been more rambunctious than usual. If they get hungry enough, they'll attack this place. You wait and see. They had a ring around it last night and the night before. Just because they've never bothered a gallery before doesn't mean that they won't. If they get hungry enough and think there's food here, they'll do anything. Looking through the barred windows, Mandy said, How can you tell what they're doing or thinking? They're too far away. From here they look like bugs. If they did attack us, and they won't, then the government would protect us. Fitch was 30 years old. Mandy was 27. They'd been cellmates for 15 years. The gallery life was the only life they knew. Fitch flung himself down on the cot and said, I don't care what you say. I don't like it. We've been deprived of a decent diet for so long that we couldn't protect ourselves if we had to. We don't even think straight, if you ask me. We've been isolated here for so long that we have no idea of what the outside is like. They're probably hungrier out there than we are in here, Mandy said. He crossed the floor and sat down. The room, like all the others in the gallery, was small. Worn boards creaked, and moisture sometimes appeared on the floor. But on the walls, old masterpieces hung so closely together that no wall space showed between. Old plaster and gilt-framed paintings rose from the ceiling to the floor. No one except the artists who had been imprisoned in the galleries throughout the continent had seen any of the ancient paintings now for 300 years. Some of the canvases were cracked, some peeling, and a few were still in amazingly good shape. Fitch said quarrelsomely, "I still can't see how artists caused wars when they produced stuff like this. I mean, those paintings look empty and meaningless to us because they don't have any real message. They don't incite people to grow food or produce. They aren't essentially art because they aren't economically vital. But otherwise, they do have a strange life of their own. I can't see the artists who painted them inciting the populace to war. There isn't any evidence of war in the canvases themselves." "Yeah, well, it wasn't only the artists," Mandy said self-righteously. "The writers and musicians did the same thing. They only thought of themselves. They dealt with ideas, and ideas caused wars." "You've been reading the history books, the government ones," Finch said. "You should read the other books in the writers' divisions on the lower floors." "What for?" Mandy said. "The stuff in those books didn't really happen. It's all fiction. The writers now have a heck of a time rewriting those manuscripts to make them meaningful. Most of it is a lot of rubbish. Hardly anyone can read nowadays. That's where we have it, over the writers. People always look, you know. I bet the government is right and the populace still hates the artists after all this time. The artists really caused wars. We're lucky they let us exist. It isn't a bad compromise. This way we work at our paintings and help the civilization at the same time." "For what?" Finch said. "Civilization? What civilization? The world is so full that you can't breathe. Nothing is cheaper than life is. Look at the people outside. They won't even work to produce their own food unless they're pushed into it. Otherwise, they wouldn't need us to plaster every available corner with pictures of food and production. Artistic motivation. I'm sick of the phrase. Make people produce more food to feed more people so that they can produce more food. It's a vicious cycle. Not only that, but it's impossible to feed everyone to begin with. Well, the plagues always come. Maybe the next one will end the cycle." Mandy grinned tolerantly. "Centuries ago, war was the problem. Now it's population. So what? If it isn't one thing, it's another. Maybe we should bring war back into existence." He grinned. "No, it wouldn't work. The people would be too hungry to fight. Besides, we'd just end up trading national diseases. The rest of the world is supposed to be worse off than we are. That's your trouble. You don't know when you're well off. The United States is the most enlightened country in the world, and the best fed. I suppose that City 16 here was better in the past just because it was called Elmira. But there used to be spaces between cities, Finch said. Not the Contropolis, not a solid continental mess of people. How do you know? Mandy said. That's another trouble of yours. You believe everything you read, and you read too much of the wrong stuff. Out in the hall a bell clanged. Finch stood up, scowling. He was of medium height, with dark brown hair and heavy brows. The other artists nicknamed him the Scowler, and sometimes they called him the Rebeller, because he was never satisfied with the way things were. He had an abrupt, self-contained gait. Mandy was shorter, with blonde clumps of wiry hair. Both men were thin, like the other artists, with poor gray skin coloring. They all spilled out of their cells into the hallway. Their faces were bland with perpetual apathy and pleasant enough stupor. They walked quietly and spoke softly. They had the look of contented and resigned prisoners. Finch said loudly, "Talking instead of eating isn't my idea of the way to spend supper time." A few of the men shrugged. One of them said to Mandy, "Is he going to start up again?" And Mandy said, He's all right, aren't you, Finch?" "Just tops," Finch said glumly. The routine in the gallery seemed eternal. The artists ate a skimpy breakfast, worked from 7 in the morning until noon, ate lunch when lunch was available, exercised by shift in the courtyard below, worked again till 6, ate dinner, and worked from 7 until 8:30. The gallery housed writers, artists, and a few musicians. Sexes were segregated. Every 2 weeks, the men and women were allowed to mix indiscriminately. Any children born were immediately put in outside government nurseries where they were brought up as workers, beginning in the fields or chemical gardens at age of 6. The 15th floor art room was at the end of the dark, moldy corridor. The room was large, stuffed with easels. The artists worked shoulder to shoulder under the dim fluorescent lights, copying the paintings that lined the crumbly walls. Sometimes, when the electricity went out, they used candles. Nevertheless, Finch liked the room. He went over to his own place in the far corner and picked up his brush. He was lucky. He worked by the windows on the outside wall. Some of them had fallen out and been boarded up, and all of them were covered with wire mesh work and iron bars. But he liked to stand there and look out when he could. There were no guards in the upper stories. For one thing, there was no way to get out from there. The art warden and his staff were on the lower levels with the other administration offices, and from the 5th floor down, the halls were thick with guards. Otherwise, he might have tried to escape before. He knew of a way out through the vaults, but guards were stationed there, and the penalty for trying to escape was death. Actually, most of the men didn't need the threat of punishment. As far as Finch knew, no one ever tried to escape. They were all safe where they were. They had their painting and the necessities. The gallery was a way of life. Nevertheless, Finch saw one of the guards standing at the base of the wall outside. And as always, he frowned. Prisoners were prisoners, he thought. Even the old masterpieces on the walls seemed to mock him. They looked so secure, just having existed so many centuries. If they could talk, he thought, they could tell more about the past than he could. Sometimes he was afraid that Mandy and the others were right about him, and now he wondered about it again. The fact remained that they were all fairly contented with their lot, and he was not. He looked around at them. They worked calmly. They accepted the limitations of their environment, like all reasonable men. Yet he couldn't help being repulsed by their apathy. He knew that they were too weary and poorly nourished to question their situation or the world at large. Their energy was depleted at the end of a day's work, but he'd been born with added stamina, haunted by excess energy that drove him to distraction. He never accepted. He always questioned. Lately his concern had grown. The food rations had been cut. The periodic riots outside had become more frequent and violent. At least he thought they had. No one else bothered to watch from their cell windows. No one could corroborate his observations. Sometimes he was afraid that he was so obsessed with the outside that he imagined things, read significances and portents of danger where there were none. Now he rehashed the whole thing in his mind, trying to pinpoint his present growing fear. He was sure that he was right about the food rations. For the shortage, he thought, there could be several explanations. Perhaps conditions outside had grown worse, and there simply was not enough food available. The people's hunger could also explain the frantic rioting he thought he'd seen from the window. He was so far up, and the wall below hid so much, that it was difficult to be certain just what all the crowds meant. It was like trying to figure out ant formations. It was also fact, he told himself, that hungry people would do anything to get food. They would attack the gallery if they even suspected that rations were hidden inside. Enough of them could easily overpower the guards. While there were plenty of guards to keep a man from escaping, for many years only a skeleton crew had been on duty, concentrated in the lower levels. Sometimes even many of these were taken off to quell the continuous riots that sprang up through the city. Fitch's mouth went dry. His pulses beat faster. To be honest, he had to admit that his fear was intermixed with excited anticipation. An attack might give him a chance to escape. It would mean put up or shut up, and he might have to make the decision quickly. When it came right down to it, would he have the guts? The gallery was the only home and the only security he knew. It was one thing to talk about freedom, and another to seek it when the effort might cost him his life. For one thing, he thought, conditions outside might be worse than he imagined. All he knew was that the little information that leaked through the grapevine. But his curiosity was insatiable. His vitality had driven him mad as a youngster, so that he'd read every book he could get his hands on. The other artists considered him a harmless crank, but his reading had made him question, and his questions made him want out. He didn't want the people to attack the gallery, but his reasoning told him that they would. Now he wondered if he'd have the strength of his convictions if such a situation arose. He glowered up at the old paintings. Most of them were rotting. Bits and pieces of eyes and trees and legs were gone. He was copying a street scene by someone called Utilero. In the painting, small neat houses marched along a clean street, and the street itself was lined with trees. Fitch had never seen a tree. There were none in the city as far as he could tell, and none on the mountains. Trees themselves were taboo in paintings anyhow. So he copied the painting, shoving the houses together and changing the street into a field that was filled with growing corn. He paused a moment, looking at the painting again with some irritation. The other artists thought that the scenes depicted by the old masters were figments of the imagination, and certainly some of them seemed to have no actual relation to life. A few of them, for example, seemed meaningless and even lacked any recognizable objects at all. These, however, translated the easiest. Fitch always blithely made the circles into blazing suns, and the odd squares into geometrical meadowlands. But Utilero was different. Van Gogh was different. While the imagination could be seen at work, Fitch believed without proof that the scenes shown had an actual basis in fact. He was certain that the world at one time had looked somewhat similar to the way Utilero and Van Gogh painted it. This conviction, together with his reading in the old books section, convinced him that at one time human families had lived in individual houses, at least somewhere on earth. The allusion to such conditions were too widespread in both paintings and writings to be mere myth. He tried to imagine what it must have been like, and yet he had to admit that his theory had one serious basic flaw. If Utilero's painting depicted actual scenes from life, if they were not imaginative pictorial fantasies, then the whole world would have had to be completely different than he knew it to be. If Utilero's representation was valid, then it would mean that mankind had regressed to an astonishing, almost unbelievable degree. All the things that Fitch believed men capable of enjoying, dignity, solitude, integrity, would already have been experienced in the past, and that, he thought, was impossible. If men had ever possessed these benefits, they would never have given them up. The arguments went over and over in his mind as he worked. At the same time, the sky outside grew completely dark. Torchlight glimmered down on the hillsides, and the neon lights sparkled here and there. 8:30 came before he knew it. He filed out into the hall with the others after cleaning his brushes, and he and Mandy walked down to their cell. They had no lights at all, except in the art rooms. Finch went over to the window again, nervously. The whole city seemed to buzz with fury. Torches moved erratically now. He said, "They're coming this way." You can see the movement of the torches, even if you can't make out the people. "So what?" Mandy said. "There's always riot over one thing or another. They surrounded this place last night and the night before, and nothing happened, did it? What about the guards? They aren't just going to stand there and do nothing in case of trouble. They might even join the people if they think there's food here. Who knows? Sometimes the guards are borrowed by other government agencies, too. And suppose the people do assault this place. The rest of you will just sit by and watch it happen. You're all that unconcerned." Mandy said slowly, "Look, go to sleep, will you? This gallery's been here for 300 years, since the end of the 20th century. It's never been attacked in all that time. Why should it be bothered tonight or tomorrow?" "I watch them out there," Finch said. "You don't. Conditions are worse than they've ever been. For one thing, you're so used to being taken care of that you can't imagine that it might ever end, or that the status quo might change. you go on day by day, caught up in your own interests. I tell you, the people riot more often. They never used to come even close to this building. Now they do. Maybe we aren't as important to the government as we used to be. Maybe they can't afford to keep us. Maybe they've lost control of the people. Or maybe the whole social framework is crumbling. Look out there. Use your head, for crying out loud. He pointed to the window. Swarms of torches leapt across the muddy Chemung River in the distance and moved down toward the city proper. Finch said soberly, "Those torches speak their own language. Those people are more frenzied than ever and more desperate." "You said the same thing last year," Mandy said, grinning. "It was right then, too. Things were building up then, and they still are," Finch said. "You'll be saying the same thing next year," Mandy said. He laid down on the cot and turned his head to the wall. Finch went back to his vigil at the window. He kept telling himself that he could be wrong, but he didn't believe it. In the first place, he thought, the planet was overrun. There was no room for anything that was not human. There was no room for any human who did not work. America was the last to succumb. America was the last to succumb. And he wondered how much longer it would hold out. Africa, China, India were lost. The people there were more like animals than men. He'd heard that years ago when the radios were still operating between countries. Now, what the government knew, it kept to itself. Some things he was sure of. The Constitution of the United States was still the law of the land. The individual states still existed, but he suspected that the structure would be unrecognizable to a man from, say, the 20th century. For a moment he was lost in his thoughts. Then, suddenly, he looked out. Now whole groups of people became distinct as they moved closer, waving torches. Finally, the wind carried up the tumultuous sounds of their yelling voices. Mandy got up. He kept saying, "They're just worse than last night, that's all." But his face was white. The torches set up a red glow all about the wall. Still, it was almost impossible to scale the smooth, high sides. Lights flashed on in the courtyard. Finch couldn't see directly down, but he heard the guards rush out. A few seconds later, they took up positions just inside the wall. Finch said, "I told you, they're short of guards. They aren't nearly enough of them out there. I bet they didn't expect anything like this any more than the artists did, and they weren't prepared." He broke off. The heavy gates clanged open. A truck battered them down. He and Mandy watched with horrified fascination. From the window, the truck looked like a toy. Mandy whispered, "Why, they must have stolen a government vehicle." Though how they could, Finch only started. The attackers spilled through the gates, waving clubs and torches. End chapter 1. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.